Hey there, guys. Mr. Taylor here with part 4 of our integumentary system notes. We're going to go ahead and get started here. So there's a couple warm-up questions if you want to take a minute and answer these. And go ahead and pause your video while you do that. And then when you unpause, I'll give you the answers. So here we go. All right, so the tissues that make up the dermis. When we're looking at the dermis, we should mostly be, of course, looking for our dense, irregular connective tissue. So this is like our main tissue we're going to look for. Now, you could have also put in adipose. There is some adipose in here as well. You could have put that in. But mostly, the thing I'd be looking for is dense irregular. All right, 2 layers of the dermis. I'm going to draw this down here. So if you look at your dermis, you have a top part of the dermis, which is the papillary layer. And then down here you have the reticular layer. And of course, every time we see the word reticular, we're going to think net because it's got a network of a bunch of collagen fibers. And the papillary layer gets its name because we see these little dermal papillae. Good. Next one, function of each layer. All right, so the papillary layer is going to increase our surface area. And so this is going to provide us with our blood flow up into the epidermis. And this is going to provide us with our nerves for the epidermis. The reticular is going to provide our strength. That's what we're getting out of that. All right, next question. Tissues that make up the hypodermis. So if we come down here we find the hypodermis, and we're going to find a lot of adipose tissue. So these are supposed to be adipocytes. And then we're going to have some bands of a loose connective tissue known as areolar. Okay. And the areolar connective tissue is going to hold all of that down. So this is what makes up our hypodermis. And what's the function of the hypodermis? Hypodermis is going to store fat. It's going to store energy in the form of fat. It's going to provide insulation, and it's going to hold the skin in place and provide blood to the skin. All right, so that brings us to our accessory organs. So we're all done talking about layers of the skin. Now we're going to talk about the things that are hooked onto your skin. So the first one is hair, and the technical term for hair is pillae. I don't personally use this term very often, but that is the technical term for a hair. And basically all a hair is it's just a whole bunch of dead keratinocytes that have been pressed together and fused. So basically you fuse all these cells together and you produce this long shaft. And it's all dead keratinocytes. So this is like stratum corneum, but it's stratum corneum made into like a cylinder that extends out of the hair or out of the skin. So when we look at the hair, there's a few main parts. The shaft is everything that sticks out above the skin. So from the top, from your surface of your skin up, this is called the hair shaft. So basically the visible part of your hair is the hair shaft. Now, when we look at this in cross section, there's a couple different parts. So when you look at a hair, the outside part of the hair is called the cuticle. And the cuticle of your hair, interestingly enough, actually kind of looks like this. It's kind of a little bit jagged. And you probably know this is true because if you ever try to like comb your hair, when you comb away from the scalp, everything goes just fine. But if you try to brush or comb your hair backwards, we call that teasing because there's these little microscopic little ridges. There's actually little ridges on the outside of the cuticle that all point outward. So your hair actually has like directionality to it. So that's called the cuticle on the outside. Underneath of that, there's another layer called the cortex. And cortex, we see this word a lot, literally means bark, like the bark of a tree. And then underneath the cortex, we have like an inner layer called the medulla. And the medulla is like the center of it. It's like the core. And this is where most of the pigment is found inside of the hair. So like when your hair, if you have dark colored hair, this is probably where most of your pigment is located. So that's in a cross section that we see that. Underneath the skin, so down here, we have what is called the root. And so the root is like the extension of the hair down below the skin, and it goes pretty deep. It actually goes all the way down to the deepest part of the reticular layer of the dermis. And around that root, we find that there's a whole bunch of like skin. There's a whole bunch of like skin cells that have pushed down. So you can see like here's like our border between the epidermis and the dermis. All of a sudden that epidermis makes like a really hard turn and goes down and makes like a little pocket and then comes back up and then continues along its merry way. Well, where that epidermis folds down in, that's the follicle. And so that's like the epidermal cells that grow hair. So when your hair is growing, these cells reproduce and it makes your hair grow from the inside out. So a lot of people think that if you cut your hair, it's going to grow faster. Or if you shave, it's going to grow faster or thicker. And the truth is, no matter how much you cut your hair or shave it, it doesn't matter. You can do whatever you want up here to this hair, but the hair is going to continue to grow up and out from the inside out. So the follicle is actually the part that grows it. So if you pluck your hairs, if you pull this out and you damage the follicle, it can take a longer time for the hair to grow back, and potentially the hair may never grow back if the follicle dies. So the follicle is really important because it's the like reproductive part of the hair. And of course, there's melanocytes down in here, and those melanocytes produce the pigment that comes out in your hair. So if you have any sort of hair pigment, it's coming from the melanocytes in the follicle. When those melanocytes die, that's when your hair turns white or gray, or those melanocytes stop working. So here's a much better view of this. And we can see here's our shaft sticking up from part out. You can see how there's like our cuticle on the outside. We can see our cortex and our medulla in the center. And then we can see down here in the root, all the way down the deep dermis, almost into the subcutaneous layer. We can see our root sheath out here with the matrix. And then this is growing the new hair to come out. And here's just like a photomicrograph showing you the same thing under the microscope. And you should be able to see all the different layers here of the skin and the hair. All right, so a couple things related to hair. There's this thing called an erector pili, and this is your goosebumps muscle. Basically, what the erector pili, if you look at its name, pili, of course, means hair. Erector means like to raise or to erect. So if we go back for a second here, you can actually see this erector pili muscle in this diagram. And it's actually a little bundle of smooth muscle. And when it contracts, muscles always contract by pulling inward. So it actually pulls the root closer to one of these dermal papillae, and it pulls this dermal papillae in closer to the hair and causes it to pucker up. And so that's why you get this little lump, and there's this hair sticking out. And that's what goosebumps are. You just have a whole bunch of these little bumps with all these little hairs sticking out because these erector pili muscles down here are contracting and causing this to happen. So what's interesting about this is that we get goosebumps because if you've ever seen like a cat or a dog get in a fight and their fur stands up on end, we're basically trying to lift our hairs up to make ourselves look bigger and tougher or to keep ourselves warm. Because if we had like thicker fur and longer fur, basically what would happen is that there would be cold air out here and this fur would help to trap the warm air underneath and keep us warm. But unfortunately, because we're humans and we don't have a lot of body hair, it really doesn't do anything. So we're trying to make ourselves have a puffy coat and we don't. Color is controlled by melanin, so all the hair color comes from melanin. If you have a little tiny bit, you have blonde hair. If you have more, you have brown or black hair. And almost all of your skin surfaces have hairs. In fact, the only places you really don't have hairs are on the palms of your hand and soles of your feet, so it's not on thick skin. So you should not have any of this on your thick skin. You should not have it on your lips. And there are some parts of the external genitalia that also do not have hairs on them. There are other parts that do have hairs. So those are just the three regions that we find that are hairless skin. There is a condition called androgenic alopecia. Alopecia is the technical term for baldness. And andro means man, and genic is like produced. So this is actually male pattern baldness. And I can't really think of any examples of bald people that you would all know or that I would know. But you know, if you can imagine a man whose hair is falling out, then that's someone who's suffering from androgenic alopecia. And what's interesting is this is produced by testosterone. So testosterone in some people that have genes for it causes men's hair to fall out. Women don't normally have testosterone until after menopause. And after menopause, they start building up this stuff called an androgen, which is like a weak form of testosterone. And that's why older women will sometimes have thinning hair and often get perms, is to try to cover up the fact that they're starting to get some androgenic alopecia. But this doesn't happen until later in life, so it's not, as big of a deal. It's not as noticeable as it is with men who literally at puberty can start to lose their hair. Oh, there's an example of goosebumps for you. You can see all the little hair standing up. The anatomy test is today. Okay, so that brings us on to the glands. And basically, if you remember when we were studying the membranes, we talked about like serous, synovial, and mucous membranes, how they all had secretions. Well, these glands are the secretions of the cutaneous membrane. The first one, and these are all exocrine, I should mention that, because these are all going to secrete outside of the body. So the first one is called sebaceous, and it produces this substance called sebum, sebum. And sebum is a fancy term for oil. And so you produce oil, and it's produced down here in the roots of your hair. So remember how we talked about how the epithelium kind of makes a fold? One of those folds is the sebaceous gland, and it produces the sebum that goes up and kind of like lubricates the hair shaft. And the reason for this is, once again, remember we said the cuticle is kind of rough. This oil, the sebum, helps to slide your hair out as it's growing. And then what happens is it continues on and coats your hair. And so that's why like the roots of your hair will often get kind of like oily or greasy before the tips do. So this area is like oil city. All the way out here, you might have like some split ends because this hair is really dry out here. So if you wash your hair often, blow dry it, if it's exposed to the elements, you'll have a dry tip of your hair, and then you'll have a very like oily root. And that's very, very common. We also produce it because we have very small hairs too. You produce a lot of oil on your face, which of course can lead to acne. And we'll talk about acne in the next lecture. All right, the next type of gland is called sudoriferous, and sudoriferous means sweat. Okay? Actually, the word sudor in Spanish means sweat, so I guess that comes from the Latin word for sweat. And so there's two types of sweat glands that we have in our body, eccrine and apocrine. Eccrine sweat glands. Eccrine is another way to say merocrine. And if you remember from way back in the day when we talked about this, merocrine is just like regular secretions. This is just like your like normal sweat. So if you think about like your kind of watery, a little bit salty sweat um, that you produce basically everywhere. So just about every single part of your skin can produce it. So I always think E and everywhere, E for eccrine. So this is your like most common, found everywhere, produce normal sweat. Apocrine, on the other hand, produces a kind of like thick, milky secretion. And this thick, milky secretion is very rich in lipids and proteins, which makes it good for bacteria to eat. And when bacteria eat this stuff, it produces something called BO, or body odor. So you can imagine that apocrine sweat glands are found in places like your armpits. That's the main place we find them. There's a few other places around your body. You can also find them in your anal and genital regions. So all sorts of lovely places like that, like basically in your crotch and in your armpits. So I always remember AP for AP, apocrine, and then I think they're also found in your anal and like pubic regions, so AP. So that's where we get this name from. And basically, this stuff is producing the secretion that gives you this BO. And we don't know exactly why people have BO, but that's its point. We think that BO is kind of like a pheromone. It's kind of like a way of saying that you are sexually mature and that you are able to have children. So there you go. And the last type of gland is called ceruminous, and ceruminous glands produce a product called cerumen, which is wax. And so these are found inside of your ears. So ceruminous glands are your earwax glands. And if we look over here at this picture, we can see here is a sweat gland. So this is just an eccrine sweat gland. It looks kind of like a little knot, and it's connected to this by this duct that goes up and ends in a pore at the skin, and basically just makes a watery secretion that comes out and just kind of flows onto the surface of your skin. All right, so that's it for today. Next time, we're going to finish up all our notes. So hopefully you guys learned something good, and I'll catch you next time.